The headlights of Jacob Flores's blue Toyota Corolla cut across the empty backroads of Yolo County on a late September night in 2005. He had just left a friend's house, promising his parents he would be home before midnight, but he never made it back. There were no witnesses, no signs of a crash. By morning, Jacob had vanished, along with his car, into the silence of rural California. What followed was an agonizing search that turned up nothing. Days became weeks, and the story of an 18-year-old college freshman slowly slipped from the headlines into the archives of unsolved cases. For nearly 2 decades, the Flores family lived with nothing but questions, until one day, a pair of volunteer divers scanned a forgotten pond and found the car that had been waiting underwater for 17 years. Inside, they uncovered not just Jacob's fate, but the evidence that would expose a killer hiding in plain sight. This is the story of the night Jacob Flores disappeared, and the arrest that shocked an entire community. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you will not miss any of the stories where the truth refuses to stay buried. The night of September 17, 2005 began like so many others in the small towns that sit between Sacramento and Woodland. The air was still warm from the lingering California summer, though the fields around Yolo County had already turned dry and brittle, waiting for the coming autumn rains. Streetlights flickered over narrow roads, and the sky was a deep velvet black, broken only by the occasional passing car. For most people, it was an ordinary Saturday night. For Jacob Flores, it would be his last. Jacob was just 18 years old, a freshman at a local community college. Friends remembered him as quiet, reliable, and quick with a smile. He lived with his parents and younger brother in a modest home on the edge of Sacramento. His family had high hopes for him. He was the first in his family to take steps toward higher education, and his mother often told neighbors she believed he would go far in life. That Saturday evening, Jacob had made simple plans. A birthday gathering at a friend's house in Woodland, nothing more than a few hours of music, soda, and talk. At around 9 o'clock, Jacob pulled on his favorite red hoodie, the one his younger brother had given him the Christmas before, and climbed into his blue Toyota Corolla. The car was old but dependable, its headlights dimmer than newer models, but it had carried him faithfully through countless short drives. The Flores family watched him leave, never imagining it was the last time they would see him. The gathering itself was uneventful. The house stood at the edge of Woodland, surrounded by empty fields and dirt roads that cut away into the dark. Friends later told investigators that Jacob seemed relaxed, maybe a little tired from school, but nothing unusual. He drank soda, ate a slice of cake, and spent most of the evening sitting quietly on the porch with 2 close friends. Around 1:45, he rose from his chair, stretched, and said he should head home before his parents began to worry. Several people saw him walk out the front door and step into the cool night air. His red hoodie caught the light from the porch, a flash of color against the shadows. Jacob waved once, smiled faintly, and made his way to the small driveway where his Toyota waited. A friend remembered hearing the car door shut and the engine turn over. The headlight swept across the yard as he backed up. Then, as the Corolla turned onto the dirt road, the light disappeared into the night. No one thought much of it at the time. Teenagers left gatherings every weekend in the same quiet way. But this goodbye was different. It was the last moment anyone ever laid eyes on Jacob Flores alive. The drive back to Sacramento should have taken no more than 30 minutes. A straight shot along Highway 16, then a turn onto the familiar streets that led to his home. Jacob had driven it dozens of times before, but sometime in that half hour, something went wrong. He never made it through the front door. By morning, when Jacob failed to return, his parents' worry turned to dread. Calls to his phone went unanswered. His bed was still empty. The red hoodie and the blue Toyota Corolla were nowhere to be found. From that moment on, Jacob Flores was no longer just an 18-year-old student from Sacramento. He was a missing person, and his name was about to become part of one of California's most haunting mysteries. The sun rose over Sacramento on Sunday, September 18th, 2005. But in the Flores household there was no peace in the morning light. Normally, the sound of Jacob shuffling in the kitchen, pouring cereal, and joking with his younger brother filled the house. That morning, his chair at the table sat empty. At first, his parents thought little of it. Perhaps he had stayed the night at a friend's house. Maybe he had left early for a study group. But as the minutes stretched into hours, the explanations grew thinner. Jacob was responsible to a fault. He called if he was running late. He answered his phone when his mother rang. This time, there was only silence. By 9 o'clock, his mother, Elena, began dialing his number repeatedly. Each call rang into nothing. His younger brother walked the block, glancing at driveways, half expecting to see the familiar blue Toyota Corolla parked nearby. There was no sign of it. By noon, unease had turned into dread. That afternoon, the Flores family reported Jacob missing to the Yolo County Sheriff's Department. Deputies took down his description carefully. 18 years old, 5'10", slim build, brown hair, brown eyes, last seen wearing a red hoodie and driving a blue Toyota Corolla. The car's license plate was entered into the state database. Within hours, the Flores home was filled with relatives and neighbors. Someone brought over a stack of printer paper and an old desktop computer. Together, they designed a flyer with Jacob's senior portrait, a shy smile, his hair carefully combed, the kind of photograph parents tuck into wallets. In bold black letters, the flyer read, "Missing, Jacob Flores, age 18, last seen September 17th. His vehicle details were listed beneath. By evening, the flyers were taped to gas station pumps, grocery store windows, and telephone poles in Sacramento, Woodland, and Davis. Volunteers drove miles out into the county, plastering intersections with Jacob's face. Cars slowed as drivers took the leaflets from outstretched hands. Some looked sympathetic, others only glanced before moving on. The media soon caught wind of the story. A local Sacramento news station aired a segment showing Elena standing in front of her house, clutching her son's photograph. Her voice cracked as she spoke into the camera. "Please, if anyone has seen Jacob or his car, please call us. We just want him home." Reporters followed deputies as they searched the stretch of road Jacob should have traveled. Patrol cars combed ditches and pulled over at farm entrances. Deputies knocked on doors, asking landowners if they had seen a small blue car pass by in the night. Nobody had. By nightfall, Jacob's absence was all anyone in his neighborhood could talk about. Parents warned their own teenagers not to stay out late. Rumors began to circulate almost immediately. Some whispered he had run away. Others suggested a secret relationship, or, worse, that he had been lured into something dangerous. None of it made sense to those who knew him best. At the Flores home, the atmosphere was suffocating. The phone rang constantly, each call making Elena's heart leap with hope. More often than not, it was a friend checking in, or a stranger claiming to have seen a similar car hours away. Every lead ended in disappointment. That first night, Jacob's father sat silently on the porch, staring down the road as if waiting for headlights that never came. By the end of that first day, the gravity of the situation settled over everyone. Jacob Flores was gone, his car was gone, and there was not a single clue to explain why. What had started as a missed curfew was quickly transforming into something darker, a case that would grip a community and leave a family desperate for answers. By the second day of Jacob's disappearance, the case had shifted from a family's private nightmare to a full-scale community search. Yolo County deputies organized a command post near the route Jacob should have taken home. Patrol cars idled with lights flashing as officers fanned out across back roads, ditches, and farmland. Helicopters from the California Highway Patrol circled low, their spotlights cutting across fields of dry corn and rows of almond orchards. On the ground, volunteers moved in lines through brush and tall grass, calling Jacob's name into the wind. Dogs trained in scent detection were brought in, handlers walking them along the riverbanks and irrigation canals. Each bark or sudden tug on the leash brought a surge of hope, but every time it led to nothing. The Toyota Corolla was the focus. Deputies believed if they could find the car, they would find Jacob. Roadblocks were set up at key intersections. Officers studied traffic camera footage, but in 2005 the coverage was spotty at best. Most rural roads had no cameras at all, leaving vast stretches of darkness unmonitored. That week, the Flores family home became the center of the operation. Relatives answered phones, coordinated volunteers, and handed out stacks of flyers. Neighbors stopped by with casseroles, sandwiches, and coffee, small offerings to a family too numb with fear to eat. Each night, Elena paced the living room, clutching Jacob's school photo, whispering his name as if he might walk through the door. Reporters camped outside, their cameras aimed at the modest house. Local newspapers ran headlines: 18-year-old missing after party. The Sacramento Bee printed Jacob's face on the front page, his shy smile staring back at thousands of readers sipping coffee across the city. Television crews interviewed classmates who described him as quiet, kind, and unlikely to disappear willingly. By midweek, the search had drawn dozens of volunteers. College students, church groups, even strangers from neighboring towns joined. They trudged through fields, their shoes caked in mud, their flashlights bobbing in the darkness as they scoured canals and creek beds. Each time someone thought they saw a glimmer of metal beneath the water, deputies rushed in, only to find an old shopping cart or rusted farm equipment. The absence of results gnawed at the community. Parents began warning their children not to drive alone at night. Cafes buzzed with speculation. Some insisted Jacob must have crashed off a hidden road, the car submerged where no one had looked. Others whispered about foul play, but the silence of the case gave no answers. At night, the Flores home grew heavier with dread. Jacob's father sat on the porch, scanning the horizon for headlights that never came. His younger brother kept watch at the window, refusing to sleep until exhaustion pulled him under. Elena remained restless, sitting by the phone, jumping at every ring. By the end of the first week, deputies admitted what the family already feared. There were no leads, no credible witnesses, not a single piece of physical evidence. The car had vanished, as if swallowed by the earth. Still, the search continued. Volunteers returned every weekend, retracing steps, wading through rivers, pushing through reeds taller than their heads. The sheriff's office issued updates to the press, repeating the same plea: if anyone has seen Jacob Flores or his blue Toyota Corolla, please call. But each day ended the same. Empty hands, empty roads, empty promises. And with every sunrise, the grip of fear on the community tightened. A boy had disappeared into the darkness, and no one could explain how. As the days of searching dragged on with no trace of Jacob or his car, the silence began to fill with whispers. In a town like Woodland, where everyone knew everyone else, speculation spread faster than any official report. People gathered in cafes, outside grocery stores, and in church pews, trading theories about what could have happened on that late September night. The first rumor was the simplest: accident. Some were convinced Jacob must have veered off a narrow road and crashed into one of the deep irrigation canals that crisscrossed Yolo County. Those canals are like traps. one farmer told the local paper. "If a car goes in, you may never see it again." Deputies had dragged several canals already, but found nothing. Still, many clung to the idea that Jacob was out there, submerged, waiting to be discovered. Others believed he had run away. To them, the quiet, responsible teenager might have been hiding a secret life. At the grocery store, whispers of, maybe he was under pressure from school, or maybe he wanted to escape, floated between aisles. But those closest to Jacob pushed back. His friends insisted he had been looking forward to his classes, and his family swore he would never leave without saying goodbye. Then came the darker rumors. Some claimed Jacob had been lured into danger. Parents reminded their kids of stories about strangers offering rides or acquaintances pulling people into trouble. At one point, a caller phoned in a tip suggesting Jacob had been spotted getting into a pickup truck that night, but deputies could never verify it. The story faded, leaving only more unease. Another rumor centered on a girl. Woodland High School alumni recalled whispers of Jacob spending time with a classmate he liked, someone older. Someone who had recently broken off a relationship. The suggestion was that maybe jealousy or a secret meeting had played a role, but no evidence surfaced, and the young woman in question denied any involvement. Still, gossip spread, fueled by imagination more than fact. Theories piled up, and with them, tension grew. For the Flores family, each rumor cut like a knife. Neighbors they had known for years now speculated in hushed voices. At one vigil, Elena overheard two women whispering about whether Jacob might have been in trouble with the wrong crowd. She broke down in tears, sobbing that her son was not the type. He was not reckless. He was not running from anyone. He was simply gone. Detectives faced the same frustration. With no leads, every rumor had to be considered. Tips flooded the sheriff's office, some from as far away as Los Angeles, claiming to have seen someone resembling Jacob. Deputies followed them, often driving for hours, only to find nothing. Each false lead drained resources and patience, yet the family clung to any chance of finding him. The media fanned the flames. Local newspapers printed speculative headlines. Was Jacob Flores taken? And missing student may have run away. Television anchors debated theories in evening broadcasts, presenting conjecture as if it were possibility. For viewers, it was a mystery to solve. For the Flores family, it was torture. By the end of the first month, the weight of unanswered questions pressed on everyone. Friends who once insisted on Jacob's safe return began to avoid the Flores home, unsure what to say. Some feared that the truth, whatever it was, might be darker than anyone wanted to admit. The rumors did what silence often does. They created stories in the void where facts should have been. But none of them brought Jacob home. And as October slipped into November, it became clear that this was no ordinary disappearance. Something else had happened on that road, something no rumor could fully explain. By the winter of 2005, 3 long months after Jacob Flores disappeared, the search effort had slowed to a crawl. The volunteers who once lined up every weekend to scour fields and canals began to dwindle. The television crews that had camped outside the Flores home packed up and moved on to newer stories. The nightly vigils that once filled the street with candlelight shrank to a handful of family and neighbors. For the Flores family, the silence was deafening. Each day began the same way, checking the answering machine, hoping for a message, scanning newspapers for updates, and calling the sheriff's office for any sign of progress. The answer was always the same: nothing. Deputies had run through every tip, interviewed classmates, tracked phone records, and searched countless miles of farmland. The Toyota Corolla remained missing. No witnesses had come forward. No physical evidence tied anyone to the case. It was as if Jacob and his car had vanished into thin air. By early 2006, the case was officially reclassified. What began as an urgent missing persons investigation was now moved to the cold case files. For detectives, it was a painful but practical decision. Resources were limited, and newer cases demanded attention. For the Flores family, it was devastating. Elena, Jacob's mother, remembered the day she was told. A detective sat at her kitchen table, hands folded, voice calm but firm. He explained that all active leads had been exhausted, but the case was not forgotten. "We'll keep it open," he said, "and if anything new comes up, we'll revisit it." To Elena, those words felt like a death sentence for hope. The neighborhood began to adjust in uncomfortable ways. At first, friends had dropped by daily with food and comfort. But over time, the visits became less frequent. Some neighbors, not knowing what to say, avoided the Flores family altogether. Others muttered theories behind closed doors, speculating whether Jacob had run off by choice or met a darker fate. The isolation deepened the family's grief. At school, Jacob's absence was felt in small but painful ways. Teachers kept his name on the attendance roster, hesitating before skipping past it. Friends left his seat empty during study groups. The red hoodie he often wore became a symbol among classmates, a reminder that someone from their world could vanish without explanation. For detectives, the lack of progress was equally frustrating. In 2005, forensic technology was limited compared to what it would become years later. DNA testing was slower, digital records were harder to trace, and many rural areas had no surveillance cameras. Leads that might have cracked the case in later decades simply went dark. By 2007, Jacob's file was stamped inactive. It was moved to a shelf in the sheriff's office, one of dozens of unsolved cases waiting for a miracle. For the Flores family, the news was unbearable. His father stopped attending community meetings about the case, unable to stomach the pity in people's eyes. His younger brother grew quieter, carrying the weight of being the child who remained when the older one was gone. Still, the family refused to let Jacob's memory fade. Each September, on the anniversary of his disappearance, they organized a candlelight vigil. Photographs of Jacob lined the porch. Friends and relatives lit candles and prayed. Some years, dozens came, other years, only a few. But the candles always burned, a flickering reminder that one family would not let the world forget. The case may have gone cold in the eyes of investigators, but for the Flores family, it never was. The pain remained raw, the questions endless. Jacob was still missing. His car was still missing. And without answers, the darkness of that September night hung over them like a shadow that would not lift. By the second anniversary of Jacob's disappearance, the search had long since ended. The flyers were weathered and torn, fading on telephone poles that no one bothered to replace. The sheriff's office had no new updates to give, and the case sat dormant in the cold case files. Yet inside the Flores home, Jacob's presence was kept alive in ways both small and profound. Each September, on the night he vanished, Elena Flores placed candles in the front window of their modest Sacramento home. At first, it was a neighborhood ritual. Dozens of people would gather in the yard, holding photographs of Jacob, whispering prayers, and sharing memories. The glow of candlelight spilled out onto the street, warm against the cool autumn air. Neighbors bowed their heads as Jacob's father thanked them for coming, his voice trembling. In the early years, the vigils drew media attention. Local reporters set up cameras, capturing images of flickering flames and grieving parents. They broadcast Elena's words as she begged anyone with information to come forward. "Someone out there knows what happened to my son," she said again and again. But as time passed, the gatherings grew smaller. By the 5th year, only close friends and family remained. Reporters stopped coming. The neighbors who once lined the street moved on with their lives. The candles still burned, but the audience had dwindled. Inside the Flores household, the ritual meant more than words could capture. For Jacob's younger brother, now in high school, it was a reminder that his sibling was not forgotten. For his father, it was a vow to never give up, no matter how many years passed. And for Elena, it was both an act of devotion and defiance, proof that her son's story was still alive, even if the world chose to look away. Every September, she prepared the same way. She cleaned Jacob's bedroom, still untouched, the bed neatly made with his old blanket. She placed his schoolbooks back in order, dusted the photographs on his dresser, and laid out the red hoodie he had been wearing the night he vanished. Then, when evening came, she lit the candles one by one, their flames reflected in the glass of the front window. To passing cars, it was a quiet, almost ghostly sight, a home glowing with light, standing against the darkness of unanswered questions. The act became a kind of ritualistic anchor for the family. Even when cousins or friends could not attend, Elena lit the candles. Even when rain threatened to extinguish them, she relit each flame. It was her way of speaking to Jacob, of telling him he was still part of their world. Over the years, strangers occasionally stopped by. A woman who had seen the story on television once left flowers on the porch. A young man who went to school with Jacob stood silently in the yard before walking away. Small gestures, but each one reminded the family that they were not entirely alone. For law enforcement, the vigils served as quiet reminders, too. Every time deputies drove past the Flores home in late September and saw the window glowing, they remembered the case file sitting on their shelves. A boy still missing. A car still unaccounted for. A family still waiting. As the second decade approached, the candles had become more than a family tradition. They were a symbol of persistence, of grief, of love that refused to let go. Even as the world moved forward, the Flores family stayed rooted in that night in 2005, holding on to the only light they had left. By 2022, Jacob Flores had been gone for 17 years. His case was one of hundreds stored in the Yolo County cold case files, a thick binder of reports, interviews, and photographs gathering dust on a shelf. To the outside world, Jacob had become just another unsolved mystery, a face fading from memory. But to his family, he was still very present, his absence an open wound. Then, almost by chance, a small spark reignited the case. It did not come from the sheriff's office or a breakthrough in forensics. It came from a group of volunteers known across the country for their unusual approach to solving cold cases. They were civilian divers, men and women with sonar equipment and boats, who spent their free time scanning lakes, rivers, and ponds in search of missing people and submerged cars. Over the years, their work had brought closure to dozens of families. One afternoon in the spring of 2022, the team received a message through their social media account. It was short, almost cryptic. "Check the pond near Dixon Road. That boy from 2005, he might be there." At first, the divers were skeptical. They received hundreds of tips every year, most of them dead ends. But something about this one felt different. The location lined up with the route Jacob should have taken home that night, and the timing, late September, after a friend's party, matched what they had read online about his disappearance. Within weeks, the team drove their equipment out to Yolo County. The pond in question was small and unremarkable, surrounded by farmland and overgrown with reeds. Most locals barely noticed it as they drove by. But beneath its still, dark surface, the sonar revealed a shape. a long, shadowy outline, partially buried in silt, sitting at an unnatural angle. To the trained eye, it looked like a vehicle. The divers marked the location and alerted the sheriff's office. Deputies arrived within hours, setting up a perimeter around the water's edge. News spread quickly. By evening, a handful of neighbors stood at the fence line, watching as boats drifted across the pond and equipment was lowered into the water. Some whispered that maybe this was finally it, the answer to 17 years of questions. The operation took hours. The car was heavy, its frame corroded and tangled in weeds. But slowly, inch by inch, a blue Toyota Corolla emerged from the murky depths. Its windows were shattered, its paint eaten away by time and water, but the license plate was still legible. It matched Jacob's. For deputies, the discovery was monumental. The vehicle that had vanished without a trace in 2005 had been sitting less than 5 miles from the route Jacob should have taken home. It had been there the whole time, hidden in plain sight, overlooked in the initial searches nearly 2 decades earlier. Inside the car, divers found human remains. Alongside them were fragments of clothing, faded but still recognizable. A red hoodie, torn and waterlogged, clung to the skeletal frame. In the glove compartment, a student identification card bore the name everyone had been waiting to hear: Jacob Flores. The Flores family was notified that evening. When deputies knocked on their door, Elena already knew. She had felt it in her chest the moment the sun went down, the weight of a truth finally surfacing. Through tears, she told reporters later, "I prayed every day for answers. I did not want this to be the answer, but now at least we know." The discovery of Jacob's car was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. What at first looked like an accident would soon reveal something far more sinister, and the man responsible had been hiding in plain sight all along. The morning after the sonar discovery, the pond near Dixon Road became the center of attention in Yolo County. Yellow police tape surrounded the area as deputies, divers, and forensic teams prepared for a recovery operation that would change everything. The air was heavy with anticipation. For nearly 2 decades, the Flores family had lived without answers. Now, all eyes were on the water. The process was slow, methodical, and difficult. The vehicle, submerged for 17 years, was buried deep in mud and silt. Divers worked in near-total darkness, their hands feeling along the corroded frame as they attached heavy-duty cables. A tow truck rumbled into position, its winch groaning as it began to pull. Slowly, inch by inch, the car emerged from the pond, dripping with water and tangled with weeds. Spectators gasped as the roof broke the surface. First came the shattered glass of the windows, then the rusted blue paint that once gleamed under California's Sunday. By the time the entire vehicle rested on the bank, its shape was unmistakable. The blue Toyota Corolla that had been missing since September of 2005 had finally been found. Inside the car was a scene frozen in time. Forensic experts, wearing gloves and masks, carefully pried open the doors, their hinges corroded and stubborn after years underwater. The interior was filled with silt and debris, but within the wreckage lay human remains. Bones were scattered but intact enough to suggest a single occupant. Alongside them, faded clothing clung to the frame. A red hoodie, discolored by years beneath the water, still bore the faint outline of its logo. It was the same hoodie Jacob had been wearing the night he disappeared. Investigators also uncovered a cracked student identification card wedged between the seats. The name printed across it erased all doubt. Jacob Flores. After nearly 2 decades of searching, his family's worst fears had been confirmed. Deputies worked through the day, cataloging every piece of evidence. The remains were carefully removed, placed in sealed containers, and transported to the county coroner for analysis. The Corolla itself was lifted onto a flatbed truck, its tires shredded, its metal rusted through, yet still holding secrets that investigators hoped could be unlocked. News of the recovery spread quickly. By evening, television stations across Northern California were running live broadcasts from the scene. Images of the car, dripping and broken, flashed across screens. Reporters described the moment the license plate was confirmed, a grim but definitive link to the teenager who had disappeared 17 years earlier. At the Flores home, grief and relief collided. Neighbors gathered quietly on the porch, embracing the family as Elena clutched her son's photograph. Through tears, she told a reporter, "I always prayed for answers. I never stopped praying. Now I know my boy is gone, but I can finally bring him home." The discovery reignited the investigation in ways few expected. At first glance, many assumed the case was over. To some, it looked like a tragic accident, a teenager driving late at night, veering off the road, and ending up in the pond. But forensic specialists quickly began to notice details that did not fit that narrative. The airbags had never deployed. The seatbelt on the driver's side showed no signs of use, and most chilling of all, Jacob's remains were not found in the driver's seat but in the back. Those findings shifted the tone of the entire operation. What began as the recovery of a missing person's car was now the reopening of a possible homicide investigation. Detectives who had not thought about the case in years suddenly found themselves poring over old reports, re-interviewing witnesses, and reconsidering suspects. For the Flores family, the discovery brought bittersweet closure. They finally knew where Jacob had been all those years. But the new questions it raised threatened to plunge them back into a different kind of uncertainty. If Jacob had not died in an accident, then someone had put him in that pond, and after 17 years of silence, the truth was about to resurface. When Jacob's car was hauled out of the pond, many in the community thought the mystery had been solved. The simplest explanation was that it had been an accident, a young man driving home late at night, losing control, and tragically slipping beneath the water unnoticed. But the closer investigators looked, the less sense that story made. The coroner's office began its examination of the remains. 17 years underwater had stripped away flesh and muscle, leaving mostly bone. Still, the skeleton carried secrets. Forensic anthropologists discovered evidence of blunt force trauma at the base of the skull. The injury was not consistent with a car crash. Instead, it appeared to be the result of a heavy blow delivered before Jacob ever entered the water. That discovery immediately shifted the investigation. If Jacob had been struck on the head, then he had not been behind the wheel when the car entered the pond. He had been placed there. What had once been a tragic accident was now classified as a suspicious death. Investigators turned their attention back to the Toyota Corolla. The airbags were intact, never deployed. That meant there had been no sudden impact against the front of the vehicle. The driver's seatbelt showed no signs of use that night. More troubling still, Jacob's remains were found in the back seat, not the front. The position of the bones, along with the torn hoodie, suggested he had been placed there after the fatal blow. Technicians combed through every inch of the vehicle. In the rear passenger door, despite years underwater, they found traces of fingerprints preserved in a thin layer of residue. It was a long shot, but advances in forensic technology since 2005 made it possible to test them. The results were sent to the state database for comparison. Detectives also examined Jacob's old flip phone, recovered waterlogged but intact enough to yield data. Specialists managed to extract fragments of text messages. One of them, sent just minutes before Jacob left the party that night, chilled investigators. Meet me by the old mill. Do not tell anyone. That single letter became the most important clue of the case. Who was R? And why had Jacob agreed to meet them in secret? As word of these developments spread, the community reacted with shock. For years, people had comforted themselves with the idea that Jacob's death had been an accident, tragic but unintentional. Now the truth was darker. Someone had been with Jacob the night he disappeared. Someone had lured him out and struck him down before hiding both him and his car in the pond. The Flores family faced the news with mixed emotions. Closure had seemed possible when the car was first discovered, but now a new storm of questions emerged. Helena told reporters, "I always knew something wasn't right. My son didn't just drive off the road. Someone did this to him. And they have been living free all these years." Detectives reopened their files. Old interviews were re-examined. Former friends, classmates, and neighbors were contacted again. Theories that once seemed like gossip were reconsidered in light of the new evidence. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, the case of Jacob Flores was alive again. The pond had given up its secret. It revealed not just where Jacob had been all those years, but that he had not died alone. Somewhere out there, a killer had been hiding in plain sight. And thanks to modern forensics, the trail was finally warming. The waterlogged flip phone recovered from Jacob's car looked like little more than a relic from another time. Its screen was cracked, its casing corroded, and the battery long dead. Most investigators assumed it would yield nothing after 17 years submerged in muddy water. But technology had advanced far beyond what was available in 2005. Digital forensics experts carefully dried the device, removed the SIM card, and began extracting what fragments of data still remained. Days later, they struck gold. Hidden deep in the recovered files was a single text message, time-stamped at 11:42 p.m. on the night Jacob disappeared. The message read, "Meet me by the old mill. Do not tell anyone, R." The words hit investigators like a thunderclap. For years, the case had been starved of evidence. Now, here was something concrete. Jacob had not simply left the party to go home, as everyone assumed. He had gone to meet someone who identified themselves only with the letter R. Detectives immediately revisited the timeline. Jacob had left his friend's house around 11:45, just minutes after the text was sent. The message explained why he never made it directly home. He had been lured elsewhere, to a location deliberately chosen for its isolation. The old mill, abandoned and half hidden by weeds, sat along a desolate stretch of road near Dixon. It was a place where no one would have seen or heard what happened next. The text also suggested secrecy. Do not tell anyone. Whoever R was, they wanted Jacob alone. That single detail transformed the message from curious to ominous. It was not a casual invitation. It was a calculated setup. Detectives pulled old interview notes from 2005. They scoured for anyone in Jacob's circle whose name, nickname, or initial began with the letter R. Several possibilities emerged. There was a classmate, a former neighbor, and an older acquaintance with a history of trouble. Each name was cross-referenced against past statements and alibis. At the same time, forensic specialists worked to recover more from the phone. Most of the data was corrupted, but fragments of call logs hinted at repeated communication with the same number in the weeks leading up to Jacob's disappearance. The number, traced through old carrier records, had once belonged to a man investigators remembered well, Robert Vega. Back in 2005, Vega had been questioned briefly. He lived nearby, knew Jacob through mutual friends, and was seen around Woodland in the weeks before the disappearance. But with no evidence tying him to the case, deputies let him go. Over the years, his name slipped into the background, just another lead that went nowhere. Now, with the recovered text, everything pointed back to him. When the Flores family was told about the message, Elena wept. The words haunted her. "Meet me by the old mill." For her, it confirmed what she had always believed. Her son had not gone willingly into that pond. Someone had tricked him, hurt him, and left him to vanish. "He trusted the wrong person," she told reporters, "and they took him from us." The discovery of the final message electrified the case. For detectives, it was the missing puzzle piece. For prosecutors, it was evidence that could finally be presented in court. For the community, it was a chilling realization. All those years, the killer had been among them, hiding behind a single initial. The message was short, only 7 words, but it carried the weight of 17 years of silence. It was Jacob's last communication, a ghostly echo from the night he disappeared. And it was enough to bring investigators face to face with a suspect they had overlooked nearly 2 decades before. When detectives traced the final text message back to an old number, one name surfaced from the case files, a name that investigators remembered but had not spoken in years. Robert Vega. Back in 2005, Robert was 23 years old, a former neighbor of the Flores family. He had lived only a few blocks away during Jacob's childhood, often seen hanging around the same parks and basketball courts. For a time, Robert and Jacob had been friendly, but as Jacob grew older and focused on school, Robert's life took a darker turn. Robert had a reputation. He was the kind of young man who floated on the edge of trouble, petty thefts, late-night fights, whispers of drug use. Nothing ever stuck long enough to put him behind bars, but everyone in the neighborhood knew his name. By the time Jacob entered high school, Robert was already being watched by deputies for small-time crime. Despite their different paths, the two remained loosely connected. Jacob's cousin had dated Robert briefly, creating an awkward tie that lingered even after the relationship ended. Friends recalled moments when Robert would show up at gatherings uninvited, hovering near Jacob, trying to spark conversation. Jacob, polite but reserved, usually kept his distance. When Jacob vanished in 2005, Robert was questioned. Deputies asked where he had been that night. His answer was vague, at home, watching television. He had no one to confirm his story. But with no physical evidence tying him to Jacob's disappearance, the lead went cold. His name was noted, then buried among dozens of other interviews. Now, nearly 2 decades later, Robert's name returned with force. The text message recovered from Jacob's phone bore the unmistakable mark of someone who knew him well enough to arrange a secret meeting. And the letter R, once overlooked as coincidence, now looked like a signature. Detectives began digging into Robert's life since 2005. He had bounced between jobs, mostly mechanical work in auto shops around Stockton and Sacramento. Neighbors described him as quiet, keeping to himself, rarely inviting anyone over. To some, he was just another man trying to get by. To others, he was odd. Someone who carried a past no one wanted to ask about. Old reports revealed more. Robert had once borrowed money from Jacob, a small loan meant to cover car repairs. When Jacob asked for repayment, Robert had grown defensive. Friends remembered tension between them in the weeks before Jacob disappeared. One recalled hearing Jacob say, "I don't want to deal with him anymore." As detectives pieced together the puzzle, they realized the motive could have been simple: pride, resentment, or anger over being rejected. Combined with Robert's troubled history, the opportunity was clear. He knew Jacob's schedule. He knew his routes home, and he knew the old mill, an isolated landmark on the outskirts of town. The Flores family, when told of Robert's connection, reacted with disbelief. They remembered him as the boy next door who once shot hoops with Jacob. The thought that he could have been involved in Jacob's death was almost too much to process. "We let him into our home," Elena whispered. "We trusted him." But for investigators, the picture was sharpening. The fingerprints recovered from the car were now being compared to Robert's records. If they matched, it would be the final link between the mysterious text, the abandoned car, and the man who had slipped through their fingers in 2005. The name Robert Vega, once just a faint note in the margins of an old case file, was now at the center of the investigation, and soon the evidence would prove whether he had been hiding in plain sight all along. By late 2023, the evidence against Robert Vega was no longer circumstantial. The fingerprints pulled from the rear passenger door of Jacob's Toyota Corolla were tested with modern forensic methods unavailable in 2005. The results were undeniable. The prints matched Robert Vega. Combined with the recovered text message, the timeline was clear. Robert had lured Jacob out that night with the promise of a meeting at the old mill. He had struck him, placed his body in the back seat, and driven the car into the pond where it would remain hidden for nearly 2 decades. The story that had once been speculation was now backed by hard evidence. Detectives drafted an arrest warrant. On a cold November morning, a team of deputies assembled quietly in Stockton, where Robert was living in a small one-bedroom apartment above an auto repair shop. They parked unmarked vehicles along the street and waited for him to appear. At 7:30 a.m., Robert stepped outside, coffee in hand, ready to head to work. Within seconds, deputies surrounded him. One officer ordered him to the ground, while another cuffed his hands behind his back. Neighbors, startled by the commotion, peered from their windows as the man they had known for years as a quiet mechanic was led away in shackles. For some, the sight was shocking. "He kept to himself," one neighbor later told reporters. "Always polite, never caused trouble. I never would have imagined this." For others, it was a grim confirmation of old suspicions. "There was something about him," another resident said. "He always seemed like he was hiding something." Robert was transported to the county jail, booked on charges of first-degree murder. As he was processed, detectives noted his silence. He offered no explanation, no denial, no emotion. His face remained blank, as though he had prepared for this day for years. The arrest made headlines across California. News stations replayed footage of deputies leading Robert in handcuffs, his head bowed, his once-hidden life now on full display. The story of Jacob Flores returned to the front pages, not as a mystery, but as a case finally breaking open. For the Flores family, the moment was bittersweet. Elena, clutching her son's photograph, addressed the cameras outside her home. Tears streaked her face as she said, "For 18 years we lived in the dark. We prayed for answers, and now we have them. My son was taken from us, but his voice has finally been heard." Jacob's father, usually reserved and quiet, spoke only a few words. "Justice has been a long time coming." His younger brother, now an adult, admitted he had grown up in the shadow of unanswered questions. "It shaped my whole life," he said. "Now, at least I know the truth." The arrest reverberated throughout Yolo County. People who had once whispered theories now confronted the reality that a killer had been living among them. Parents who once told their children to avoid dark roads felt both relief and unease. Relief that the case was solved, but unease knowing it took nearly 2 decades to get there. Inside the jail, Robert awaited trial, his future uncertain. Prosecutors began preparing their case, armed with the fingerprints, the text message, and the testimony of experts who could prove Jacob had been killed before the car ever entered the water. For the community, the arrest was a turning point. The name Jacob Flores was no longer just a cold case on a forgotten shelf. It was a story of justice delayed but not denied. And for the first time in 18 years, the Flores family could see the possibility of closure on the horizon. The arrest of Robert Vega did not end the Flores family's ordeal, but it marked the beginning of a new chapter, one where silence was replaced by answers, and speculation gave way to justice. In the months that followed, prosecutors built their case. They presented the fingerprints found on the rear passenger door of Jacob's Toyota, the text message luring him to the old mill, and the forensic evidence that proved Jacob had been struck before being placed in the car. Experts testified that the airbags and seatbelts showed no sign of use, confirming the vehicle had been staged to look like an accident. For the jury, the evidence was compelling. The most damning detail was the message itself. "Meet me by the old mill. Do not tell anyone. R." It was more than coincidence. It was intent. A breadcrumb left behind, preserved against all odds, waiting nearly 2 decades to be uncovered. As the trial unfolded, the Flores family sat in the courtroom each day. Elena often clutched Jacob's photograph in her hands, refusing to let go. His father sat beside her, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the man accused of stealing their son's future. Jacob's younger brother, now a grown man, described the pain of living in the shadow of unanswered questions. "It changes you," he said softly, "when you spend your whole life wondering if your brother will ever come home." In closing arguments, the prosecutor's words cut through the courtroom. For 18 years, Robert Vega walked free, carrying a secret he thought would never surface. But truth has a way of rising, just like Jacob's car rose from that pond. Justice has been delayed, but it cannot be denied. When the jury returned, the verdict was swift: guilty of first-degree murder. The sentencing followed weeks later. The judge, addressing Vega directly, spoke of the cruelty of stealing not only a young man's life, but also nearly 2 decades of peace from his family. Vega showed little emotion as the sentence was read: life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the Flores family, the verdict was both devastating and healing. They would never see Jacob walk through their front door again. They would never hear his laugh or watch him graduate, marry, or build the future he dreamed of. But they had answers. They had truth. And they had justice. At a press conference outside the courthouse, Elena stood before reporters. Her voice shook, but her message was strong. "My son's story will not be forgotten. We lit candles every year to keep his memory alive, and now those candles can burn with the knowledge that his killer has been held accountable." Neighbors who once whispered theories now gathered in support. A memorial was held at Jacob's old school, where teachers and classmates shared memories of his quiet smile and gentle nature. Candles once again flickered in the Sacramento night, but this time they carried a different meaning, not only grief, but also resolution. The community of Yolo County was shaken, but also reminded of something important, that no matter how much time passes, justice can still be found. Technology, persistence, and the love of a family had brought Jacob's voice back after years of silence. For nearly 2 decades, the Flores family had lived in the shadow of uncertainty. Now, at last, they could stand in the light of truth. Jacob Flores's story is proof that justice can be delayed, but it can never be silenced. 17 years of questions ended with truth, and a community finally saw justice served. If you want to hear more stories where the past refuses to stay buried, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. That way, you will never miss the next case we uncover.